Amazon is not supposed to be part of a war story. It is supposed to be part of your shopping story, your cloud story, your normal life story. But when Iran-linked attacks start damaging Amazon Web Services facilities in the Gulf, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard begins naming major U.S. tech companies as potential targets, this stops being a Middle East headline and starts becoming something far more dangerous. A warning that the next phase of modern conflict may be aimed straight at the digital nervous system of the global economy. Reports from the Associated Press say Iranian drone strikes earlier this month damaged 3 AWS facilities in the UAE and Bahrain, while Iranian state media carried a Revolutionary Guard threat naming major U.S. companies including Apple, Microsoft, and Google as legitimate targets in the region. And here is why that matters immediately. The old version of war was oil fields, ports, bridges, and air bases. The new version still includes those, but now it also includes server farms, cloud infrastructure, communications networks, and the companies that quietly run the digital backbone of daily life. That is the shift. If you can threaten the systems that carry data, logistics, payments, identity, intelligence, and business operations, you do not just hit buildings. You hit trust. You hit continuity. You hit the assumption that the world's most powerful companies are too far away, too distributed, or too important to be touched. Iran's recent threats specifically accused major U.S. tech firms of helping identify and track targets through communications and AI services, showing that Tehran is publicly framing big tech as part of the battlefield, not outside it. That is the first thing most people miss. This is not only about physical damage. It is about redrawing the map of what counts as a target. Once a government or military force openly says tech companies are no longer neutral platforms, but operational actors, the risk changes instantly. Because now every regional office, every data center, every local contractor, every employee compound, and every dependent service becomes part of the conversation. And once that happens, the market does not wait for perfect clarity. It starts pricing insecurity. So let's get right to the big answer. What does this actually mean for the United States? It means America's dominance in tech is being tested at the point where digital power meets geopolitical vulnerability. Not in a white paper, not in a think tank panel. In real time, the world's biggest companies built their reputations on scale, speed, reliability, and reach. But war asks a more brutal question. How resilient are those promises when missiles, drones, cyber attacks, and political threats all show up at the same time? The Wall Street Journal reported a suspected Iran-linked cyber attack on U.S. medical technology company Stryker, while AP and Wall Street Journal reporting also describe broader Iranian threats toward U.S. critical infrastructure and technology companies. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable for Washington, because the Trump line on Iran has been loud, aggressive, and highly public. But every time Iran expands the battlefield, from energy to shipping to Gulf bases to tech-related targets, the White House has to decide whether it is still controlling the escalation or simply reacting to it. That is the issue, not whether Trump sounds tough on camera, whether the U.S. is shaping the fight or getting dragged into a wider one, layer by layer. AP's recent coverage describes a rapidly escalating regional conflict involving attacks on shipping, energy infrastructure, Gulf states, U.S. troops, and now explicit threats against major American firms. Because this is what flailing looks like in geopolitics. It is not always visible chaos. Sometimes it is strategic overstretch. Sometimes it is looking strong in one domain while the opponent keeps opening new fronts in other domains. Sometimes it is winning the press conference and losing the shape of the conflict. If Iran can pressure oil routes, hit Gulf infrastructure, threaten U.S. bases, expand cyber activity, and now frighten American tech companies and their regional operations, then the question is not whether Washington can hit back. Of course it can. The question is whether it can stop this war from turning into a slow, expensive multiplication of vulnerabilities. That is why the Amazon angle matters so much. Amazon Web Services is not just another company. AWS underpins huge parts of the internet, enterprise software, data storage, cloud computing, and digital operations across sectors. So even limited physical damage to AWS facilities carries symbolic force beyond the immediate operational effect. It says something terrifyingly modern. You do not have to blow up Silicon Valley to rattle the digital economy. You just have to prove that pieces of the cloud are geographically exposed, politically exposed, and suddenly part of a war map. AP reported that 3 AWS facilities in the UAE and Bahrain were damaged by Iranian drone strikes earlier this month. And here's the second thing people miss. Once tech companies themselves become part of the threat environment, the impact is not limited to one strike or one company. It ripples outward through decisions. Do companies move staff? Do they shut offices? Do insurers raise premiums? Do contractors stop showing up? Do governments pressure companies to harden systems, relocate assets, or quietly cooperate more deeply with national security agencies? That is how a military threat becomes a corporate shock. Not in one cinematic explosion, in 1,000 defensive decisions made under pressure. And the pressure is already spreading. The same broader conflict has reportedly hit Gulf airports, tankers, gas facilities, military bases, and shipping corridors. The Strait of Hormuz crisis has disrupted maritime flows and raised fears about global oil supply, while tech threats are now landing on top of that instability. That is what makes this such a dangerous moment. It is not one clean category of crisis. It is energy stress, security stress, infrastructure stress, cyber risk, and corporate exposure all colliding at once. And if you are Iran, that is not a bug. That is the strategy. You are not trying to beat the United States in a conventional head-to-head fight. You are trying to make the cost of confrontation spread wider than Washington can comfortably control. You create uncertainty in shipping. You create fear around regional bases. You create cyber disruption. You threaten brands and companies with global visibility. You make every boardroom, ministry, market desk, and military planner ask the same question. How many different fires can this crisis light at once? That is the real escalation ladder. Not just bigger bombs, more surfaces of pressure. And that brings us back to Trump. Because for all the rhetoric about strength, voters do not experience geopolitics as a map. They experience it as consequences. Higher fuel prices, more market volatility, more fear of retaliation, more talk of cyber attacks, more concern that the world's biggest companies are now in the crosshairs. If the administration looks like it keeps discovering new forms of retaliation after the fact, that is politically brutal. The AP has already linked the conflict to rising fuel prices, injuries to U.S. troops, damage to Gulf infrastructure, and expanding fallout across the region. And now the modern fear enters the frame. What if the next attack is not dramatic enough for a war movie, but damaging enough for real life? What if it is not a crater on television, but a cloud outage, a logistics disruption, a data compromise, or a regional office evacuation that cascades into service delays and financial stress? That is the thing about digital warfare and digital threats. They can feel abstract right up until they become painfully practical. A lot of Americans still think of tech power as something untouchable. The apps work, the cloud runs, the systems hum, and giant companies feel too rich and too distributed to shake. But geopolitics has a way of exposing concentration where people assumed resilience. The more the world depends on a small number of infrastructure providers, the more valuable those providers become as targets, symbols, and leverage points. You do not need to destroy the whole machine. You just need to show that parts of it are vulnerable enough to scare the people who depend on it. That is why the threats themselves matter, even before the full damage is known. When the Revolutionary Guard tells employees of named U.S. companies in the Middle East to evacuate and warn civilians near those facilities to move away, it is not just issuing a military threat. It is trying to inject fear directly into the operating system of multinational business. That is a very different kind of message from "We oppose America." It is "Your corporate footprint in our neighborhood is now part of the fight." And that kind of message works best when it lands in an environment that already feels unstable, which is exactly what this region looks like right now. Shipping disruptions, oil shock fears, airspace interruptions, missile and drone attacks, critical infrastructure under pressure, U.S. and allied forces drawn deeper in. Add direct threats to global tech companies on top of that, and suddenly the conflict looks less like a contained military exchange and more like a stress test for the architecture of globalization itself. So what happens next? There are really only three paths. 1. The threats stay mostly psychological, companies harden security, move people around, and the market calms down because no larger attack follows. That would be the best-case scenario. 2. The threats evolve into a sustained hybrid campaign. Limited physical strikes, cyber operations, intimidation, and periodic disruptions that keep companies off balance without triggering one overwhelming response. That might actually be the most likely scenario because it is cheap, deniable, and strategically exhausting. 3. A larger attack on a major U.S. corporate target or critical digital node triggers a much bigger American response, and suddenly the tech front becomes a formal part of the war instead of a frightening side channel. And here is why that third path is so dangerous. Once tech infrastructure is openly treated as war infrastructure, the line between civilian economy and military economy starts to blur. That is bad for markets, bad for companies, bad for employees, and bad for any government trying to promise the public that this is all under control. Because that is the final takeaway. This story is not really about Amazon alone. Amazon is just the perfect symbol. Familiar enough to make people pay attention. Important enough to make the threat feel real. Embedded enough in daily life to make the whole thing suddenly feel personal. When a war can touch the cloud, it can touch almost everything downstream of it. And that is the point the audience should not miss. This is not just another foreign policy headline you scroll past on the way to sports and weather. This is a glimpse of what 21st century escalation actually looks like. Not only oil fields and army bases, data centers, networks, supply chains, corporate campuses, cloud infrastructure, the hidden machinery of modern life. So if Trump keeps talking like this is just about projecting strength, but Iran keeps finding new ways to widen the battlefield, then the political problem gets harder every day. Because strength is not just the ability to strike back. It is the ability to keep a conflict from spilling into more and more systems that Americans rely on without ever thinking about them. And right now, that spillover is the story. Not just bombs, not just threats, not just rhetoric. The story is that the battlefield is moving. And the moment the battlefield moves into tech, the whole world gets closer to it.